Yep. Hey, this is Chris with Men Talk. Today we have JB here telling us a little bit about what he does, and we will just discuss past life and to where he's at now. JB, just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what you do now as far as work, and then what you want to do in the future with your job.
Yeah, my name's John Ben, better known as JB amongst the people that know me well. I grew up in Sandy, Utah. I still live in the area, live in Salt Lake City right now. I'm currently working as a mental health counselor. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a therapist, however you want to call it. I work at an inpatient trauma treatment center, a residential treatment facility with about 16 beds. I carry a client load of about 6, and also have a private practice that I run on the side. What I want to do in the future, I'd love to stay within this industry, but would love to move more into what they'd call like macro level work, where you're able to influence policy or run organizations, something along those lines.
So break us down why you want to change policies and what are you seeing that needs to change and why you think they should change?
I think if you look at that on multiple different levels, there's a lot of policy changes that need to be put in place. If you look at the access to mental health resources among the larger community, it's limited at best. But for people who are low income, people who are from disenfranchised populations, not only is our mental health resources non-existent, they're difficult to access, but they're also discouraged heavily, whether that's from societal pressures or mechanisms of the government, whatever you want to term it. So being able to increase access to mental health resources, I think would have a great benefit on society in general. On another level, I'd really like to be able to shape policy around destigmatizing mental health for men in particular. Don't get me wrong, it's not that we are like the most disenfranchised population out there, but it's a population I'm very passionate about, and being able to give men like a more kind of soft landing when getting into mental health instead of having it be so shameful or being viewed as a weakness, I think is something I'm really passionate about. So those are the two kind of big policy pushes that I'm into, increasing access and destigmatizing for men.
Okay, yeah. I agree. There's a men's group that is around that I host every once in a while, once a month. And I think that's just like one thing that we see is men, even as kids, we just grow up pushing everything aside, then having to deal with either whether it's trauma or whatever in the future. A lot of men just don't know how to talk. They don't know how to talk about feelings. A lot of men, they're married, they go to work, come home, they're with their family, and it's just the repeating cycle. Like there's no hobby. There's a lot of things I see. And I guess my next question for you, is this something that's similar in your practice that you see as well?
I think certainly I've seen quite a bit that men tend to lean towards bottling things in a little bit. The way that we've been taught to handle things is like soldier on, keep it inside. And I do think at times like that is a strength for men. Men have a lot of perseverance. We tend to push through adversity. But if we could do that while also being able to share how difficult that is for us, I think that creates a much better environment, not only for men to connect with other men, but for men to connect with other women. It creates healthier relationships. Right. I think you hear a lot about like toxic masculinity, but you don't hear an awful lot about what healthy masculinity actually looks like and how we can embody that and create that environment. Because I think a lot of the things that people are concerned about within toxic masculinity, which there are very concerning aspects of it, would be alleviated if we were able to emphasize the strengths and empower them a little bit more to get closer to an ideal of just being more open and vulnerable with each other and with their partners and families and friends and all across the board.
Yeah. And let's take a step back. Let's talk about how you got to your master's degree. I know it took a while to get there, but you're here, you're successful, and you're thriving. Break down high school, 2004 to 2006 to 2015. What did your life look like then? And then break that down until now.
Sure. I grew up as like a pretty conservative Mormon, but about at the age of 15, I left the church and then started to spiral during high school. Got kicked out of my high school, went to an alternative high school, had a drug problem all throughout that era, graduated from high school and then went to community college, but just like we'd take 2 or 3 classes and fail one of them or fail all 3 of them. And then I would be like, I'll get it together and try again in a couple of semesters. And then I just completely flop again. Did that for about 10 years or so. But when I was 29, so I started working at a local teen treatment center, which I forgot to mention. I was put in wilderness as a teenager as well.
Wow.
So part of the teen treatment industry when I was younger. I worked at a teen treatment center, which was a really upstanding, great organization. It was a very impactful experience for me. It showed me that I want to be able to help people. It drives me. So in 2018, I went back to school at the University of Utah to get my bachelor's degree. Got a bachelor's degree in social work and then started a master's degree in social work after that at the University of Utah as well. And graduated in 2022. And since then, I've just been practicing as a therapist.
You mentioned being an addict. What was it like then? How did it affect your mental health?
When I graduated high school was the beginning of what you might call like the OxyContin crisis in Salt Lake City. It's an ongoing crisis. It hasn't stopped or anything, but throughout most of high school, I just smoked a little bit of weed and had fun. But me and my friends discovered OxyContin in probably about 2007 and developed like a pretty serious habit with that for a little bit there. Sort of got clean on my own, just like grit your teeth and bear it. But yeah, it had a huge impact on my life. It cost me some friendships. Yeah. It had some issues with my development of like my career, my personal life. Clearly, It took me 10 years to finish community college. In fact, I never actually finished community college. I finished it at the University of Utah. But yeah, it shaped my life significantly, but it also taught me how to deal with adversity. It taught me that I can do hard things. And it showed me what the stakes are, like where the risk is and how far you can fall.
What was internal JB like thinking as far as you said you had to turn your life around, but what was like the specific thing that like I actually can set these goals for myself? What was that like?
What kind of goals I was setting for myself?
Yeah, to be where you're at.
It was honestly like a pretty slow developing process. If you go back to when I was like 21, 22, my goal was like basically just to have fun. I liked playing golf. I liked drinking beer and having a good time. My goals just slowly developed over time. I never really had the clear picture of where I was going. I just knew the kind of what this sense of like purpose and meaning was for me, which I think is like the more important concept for a lot of people than actually having, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
It's more like a sense of purpose and meaning establishes the direction that you're going. And then you can pick like a million different ways to get there. So for me, like I knew I wanted to connect with people. I wanted to help people. And so that always pulled me in the right direction until I stumbled on, I think I might like to be a therapist.
Yeah. Did anybody give you like any advice? Did anyone take you aside? Look, like you need to get here, like you can do it. Was there any of that?
Oh, there were tons of people along the way that helped me out with whether it was with advice or support. I will say that I was a pretty stubborn, hard-headed person. I still am, to be honest with you. I would always be able to look back and say, oh, that's why, for example, my mom would say there's safety in the rules is something she used to say to me all the time. And I'd be like, that's stupid, Mom. I'm going to break all the rules. And then I get 10 years down the line, I look back and I'm like, oh, if I know where the boundaries are, if I feel that like sense of safety because I understand what the parameters are of what I'm doing, I'm a lot more successful. So yeah, like my mom, my professional mentors have all been there along the way.
Tell us what it's been like when you were working in the transitional home.
Yeah, so I was the program director at a sober living house here in Salt Lake called Vitality Living. Fantastic program. I worked there for about 3 years. A little bit of a different experience from working in mental health. It was a lot of direct contact, doing what we'd call like case management services, helping people find a job, helping people establish themselves in the city, health insurance, any sort of social welfare programs. But it was a really valuable experience because it really taught me how to look at kind of the entire structure of a person's life. It's not just about what's going on up here. There's a lot of the actual functional pieces that have to be addressed as well. And in fact, oftentimes they're more important than dealing with your mental health crises. If you ain't got somewhere to live and you don't have a job, like so nobody's working on their depression at that point.
As a therapist, what is that you see reoccurring regarding mental health and like struggles in our society, like across the board, right? Whether it's like kids, women, men, just like everything.
Yeah. I think the one that's probably the most prevalent and obvious right now is the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. There are a lot of people who missed vital developmental stages, especially the people that were in like their late teens. Those are big identity formation years, and we're seeing a lot of people who are experiencing delayed development, which causes all kinds of mental health issues, increased depression, anxiety, trauma. A lot of people don't know how to make friends or connect or date because they spent so long inside by themselves. So that's probably one of the bigger trends that we're currently seeing right now. I think we're also certainly seeing a rise across the board in most mental health diagnoses, particularly the general ones of depression and anxiety. I think there's just a exponentially increasing amount of stress placed upon mostly like the millennial generation, Gen X, Gen Zers, all of the people that are in the working sect of society right now are experiencing rising house prices and diminishing wages and all kinds of other stuff that raise stress and anxiety. And then there's an expectation for us to be able to regulate and work through the anxiety without getting out of the stressful environment.
So if you could tell the audience, if they're having issues with anxiety, having issues with depression, what is the best advice you would give them? Let's just say they don't have the money to pay for a counselor or a therapist like yourself. They don't have insurance. How would you tell them what to do?
Whether or not you can pay for a counselor or a therapist, I think the first thing you got to do is take a hard look at what your life is looking like right now and your expectations that are placed upon yourself. Are you working like 50, 60 hours a week? Do you have 2 kids? Are you a single mom? What does your transportation situation look like? What is applying the stress that is creating anxiety and depression? And then don't expect yourself to be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get out of that without any kind of help. Oftentimes we'll see people are like, why can't I get better? Why can't I just do better? Mm-hmm. But like an important concept to understand in the mental health world is that we all only certainly have so much bandwidth, right? If I've got 100 points of bandwidth to handle and 98 of them are taken up, the minute you go over that 100, things start to deteriorate and people are expecting themselves to be able to continue doing the exact same level of effort, the exact same quality of work, but it's just not possible. My biggest thing would be reduce life stressors as much as you can. If there are things that you can change or add into your life that bring down your level of stress, then you can get an actual idea of what your mental health anxiety looks like. Because anxiety is a natural emotion that we all feel for a good reason. Back in the day, it was like, I saw a saber-toothed tiger kill Phil, so now when I see a saber-toothed tiger, I feel anxious. But these days, we have a baseline level of anxiety that is often based on danger stimuli that like we can't really control as much. So don't expect like your stress to be at a 9 out of 10 and be able to work on your anxiety. You don't even know where your anxiety is really at. Your clinical anxiety is at if you're under that much stress.
Gotcha. And then out of all those things you mentioned, like which is prevalent, finances, things, and
the stress factors?
Is finances one thing?
It really depends on like kind of the section of society you're talking about. But I do think generally you could say that the ever-growing wage gap between the top 1% or whatever you want to call them and the blue collar, even white collar working man has grown significantly over the last 70 years. And because of that, there is a significant degree of financial pressure placed on most of society. Gotcha. Comparatively.
So it's kind of off topic, but on topic. Nowadays, narcissist is thrown around so much. Everyone's a narcissist. This person broke up with me. He's a narcissist because he did such and such. Can you break that down and maybe give us like a percentage of how many narcissists there are, or can I just like break down the society? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'll tell you right off the bat, I don't have any stats on this, but I bet like maybe 5% of people that are called a narcissist have narcissistic personality disorder and actually are a narcissist. It's been a buzzword where people are like, oh my gosh, he's so selfish. He's a narcissist. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not, but like a true narcissist lacks the mechanisms to be empathetic. All things in the world are filtered through their own personal experience. So I could walk up to you and slap you and be like, why'd you make me do that? It really upset me that I slap you. That's narcissism. But there are degrees to it, and people become like selfish and self-centered. And whether that's from like a genuine place of I need to take care of myself, or it's because you have narcissistic traits.
Within your practice, you specialize in trauma and PTSD. What could you give us some examples of people that you've helped, what they've gone through, without naming their names?
That would be a good idea. Yeah, I've helped a wide range of people. My population is largely centered in young adulthood. I've worked with people who've experienced serial sexual trauma as a child. I've worked with people who have committed multiple murders.
Gang members, yeah.
I've worked with people who have experienced serial neglect as a child, which is an incredibly traumatic event. I've worked with people who've been raped. Pretty wide variety. I will say that one group that I don't often work with is combat veterans, but
Yeah.
Other than that, it's a pretty wide variety of trauma.
What's the effects of someone that gang violence, let's say that, what's the effects that they have long term from committing those crimes, like you said, killing, robbing, etc.?
Yeah, it's going to vary pretty wildly. To be honest with you, every human being processes trauma a little bit differently.
Yeah.
To use combat veterans as an example, there are men who've gone to war and come home and they're like, I'm just going to put that in a box and I'm never going to look at it again. And there's some men who will come back and have been in the same unit and done the same tour of duty and they're going to need a ton of support. So it really varies wildly. But if we look at trauma at its very core, what it is, your internal warning system gets stuck in the on position when you have PTSD. Something we call like hypervigilance is what we usually see. So I'm like constantly looking for threats. Every room I walk into, I know where the doors are at. I know how many people are in there. I see any potential weapons that might be in the room. And this sort of tends to fry your internal psyche, puts you really in a position where you're constantly on guard, which makes sure that you're constantly exhausted. And then all kinds of
just
negative
paranoid
blowback that comes into your relationships and into your life. So
Yeah.
to answer your question, it varies wildly, but
Yeah.
that's the general PTSD look.
Let me give you a scenario. So, and this was explained to me by my daughter's therapist, but I want to know your take on it. She explained how two children, one grew up in an environment that was safe. You have the other child who grew up in a environment that's just unpredictable. They both go to war. They get PTSD. One's thriving, the other one's still having a hard time. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that and why they're just living same trauma? They're living, one's thriving, one's not. Can you explain a little bit about that? Or
Yeah. There's a concept in mental health that we look at in resilience, your ability to deal with emotional distress, trauma, and continue onwards. If you look at those two different children, and one's raised in a stable environment and one's raised in chaos, we talk an awful lot. Like right now, we're talking about maybe going to war or a combat veteran, but some of the most insidious trauma occurs during childhood. Those are your developmental years. And while if you are in an abusive relationship, it's possible for us to leave. It takes a lot for somebody to leave an abusive relationship, but I can just get in my car and drive away. But a child who's being abused or neglected does not have that option. And so the traumatic experience becomes much further ingrained into their psychological makeup because it is repetitive, it is insidious, it is nonstop oftentimes, unless somebody is able to, another authority figure or adult is able to intervene. And so the child that lives in an environment like that is going to have a usually very low level of resilience. In fact, some of those children will have a much higher level of resilience because of all they've gone through. Again, human beings are complex and results vary wildly. If I'm raised in a stable, loving home with parents that are able to give me all the financial and emotional and that kind of support, I've got a much higher chance of being resilient than I do if I'm raised in a traumatic environment.
Gotcha. And then let's talk a little bit about neglect. Just an example, a child was given up at birth by their mom to another person, then that person had given them to adoption agency, and then that person was adopted. What are the effects?
It really depends on what happened in that scenario. If the birth mother was neglectful of the child, not feeding them, they're malnourished. At very young ages, from birth, it's very important that the child forms a healthy bond with their parents and often particularly with their mother. If they don't get those bonding experiences, they often have a hard time bonding with people in childhood, adolescence, adulthood, because they're not very trusting or they don't really understand a lot of nonverbal communication. They're constantly observing what you're doing, saying, how your face looks. Yeah. They're always breathing things in. And so if you can imagine that if the first year of your life is a neglectful year, it's going to really skew everything that you perceive throughout the rest of your life. Now, if the child goes to an adopted home and it's, again, neglectful, there's all kinds of negative consequences that come out of that, the timeline of the child's life.
Looking back at your life, what would you tell like your younger self? Like where are you at now being a successful, I mean, you've gone through the steps of school, getting your master's degree, you have your business. What would you tell your younger self when you were in the rut?
Buy Bitcoin. No, I'm kidding. I don't know. I probably would have just said, keep going, man. Like, even when I was in the rut, dude, I'm not really a big fan of the idea of going back and changing things or
For
trying
sure.
to like influence like the direction that I was going.
For sure.
I would have told him to just keep going. I think his intentions were good. I think his heart was in the right place. I probably would have just told him to keep going.
What is the process of going to see a therapist?
I think that's an important question to ask, especially for anybody who might be curious about it. Because I think like you watch it on TV and it's a lot of like psychiatrists, psychologists running the show. If you're seeing a good therapist, and I guess this is another really important thing to discuss, is like, how do you know if it's a good therapist or a bad therapist?
Yeah.
If you don't feel like you're in charge of the session when you're sitting in the room, that you have the ability to influence the direction of what you're talking about, like a good therapist should be a guide, not like a leader or like your sort of overseer, like telling you how you need to get better in your life. A good therapist should be empowering you with the strengths that you already have. You don't have to go in and install a whole new set of coping skills or beliefs or however you want to term it. You've already got all of the things that you need within you to be the person that you want to be, and a good therapist will help you pull those out. When you're going in to see a therapist, the biggest thing I would say is just don't let them drive the bus. You're the bus driver.
And making your time worth it when you're in there and giving them all the details. I would hold back on things that I would say just in fear of being judged. And then it's like, then you realize like she can't say anything after this. Like
She's not gonna either, nor am I. Like one thing you don't realize as well is that like one, we're bound by confidentiality, like it's a legal thing.
Right.
It'd be super fun to see your therapist. Two, like dude, when the session's over, man, I'm not thinking about you. I go home and I do my thing with my friends and my family. And trust me, when you've got me for an hour, you've got my full attention. You've got all of my expertise in there. But don't worry about a therapist judging you, dude. I don't judge anybody.
Yeah.
I've heard all kinds of stuff that I suppose other people might judge those people for, but no.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, do you see like mental health? Is it more of an addition?
The emphasis or the empowerment of the already present. If you're overusing your phone, that is a symptom of you trying to numb something else out. Now, sure, there are like people that are addicted to tech. It's a dopamine response. So every time I open my phone, I get a hit and that feels good and I got to keep doing that. But often when we're able to identify what are your strengths, what are you good at, and we're able to emphasize those things, you'll notice that like your tech addiction is a lot easier to handle. However, I will say that often we do need to remove aspects of your life in order to get to the core work we need to do.
Yeah.
The main focus of a residential treatment center, putting you in a bubble for a second because your environment, the things that are in it are just too damaging or too toxic for you to be able to do the foundational work that needs to be done.
One thing I do want to add when these questions were being asked and you were answering them, if I could say one thing about mental health, just from my personal life, I never saw it as it costs this much and I don't know if I want to go. I always saw this as an investment for my life. If I'm fixing myself, I'm able to like welcome others, be there for others, and being there to listen, being there to comfort. And the main reason why I did is just for my kids. I just wanted to fix all the shit, work with my inner self to be there for my kids and just be present. Mm-hmm. So I just think if anybody is running through those issues, it's an investment. It's not about the cost. The cost literally shouldn't matter.
If you look at your mental health as like a vehicle, if you don't do maintenance on it, your wheels are going to fall off in the middle of I-15. Sure. If you don't take care of the problems that are going on within your mental health as much as you want to take care of your kids or your family or your career, all of it's going to come crashing down. However, it's really important to acknowledge like mental health services are not cheap, and there are a lot of people who can't afford them. Medicaid, Medicare kind of services don't provide excellent mental health services all of the time. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not. So it's important to acknowledge that not everybody can afford it, but some people cannot afford to ignore it either.
That's one thing I want to do with Men Talk, like this group that I'm doing in this podcast too, is somehow pull some funds together and just keep like a little side portion in the bank where it's just, if someone needs help, like I'm willing to do that. Because I know Like, you're a resource. I wouldn't tell, just send them over. It's really important to me. And another thing too is have another portion of that just for just dads. It's no disrespect to women or anything. It's just there's so many good dads out there that don't have their kids. They're equal parents at the end of the day.
Then while I think it's easy to say that throughout the course of history, men have certainly taken the lion's share of resources, that doesn't mean that there aren't areas where there are gaps where we need additional support right now. And mental health and fathers' rights is certainly two areas where men need additional support at times.
Yeah. Are you seeing that a lot in your practice?
No, my practice largely skews young adults.
Let's talk about the younger generation. I feel a certain way about it. My views are differently than what a lot of the older generation's thinking about. There's no reason why we should be putting them down when we should be building them up. Let's talk about just the kids. What do you see within these kids? Like, where's the gap?
I'll say I don't work with a lot of children. I work with young adults. However, so this will be less about my experience and more anecdotal to a certain degree. But I think first and foremost, every generation grumbles about the next one, right? But I do think that there are several factors that are making things very difficult for young adults, children at this point. And the first and foremost among them is technology and social media.
Right.
Not that I don't think social media is pure poison, but I do think that for a child's mind who is easily susceptible to those dopamine hits I was talking about before, they just form that association so heavily. I think it also exposes them to greater risk socially than you or I ever were. You ever get really embarrassed in the lunchroom before? Or in class, 30 kids saw you puke or something. It sucked. It was pretty awful. And then the whole school knew about it.
And then you heard about it for the next month.
But imagine if that was on video and 5 million people saw it afterwards too. So I think that children take less social, they don't make leaps as much as we used to. I think it's easier to stay socially isolated. And I think one of the impact of COVID comes in here heavily, has really caused people to become socially isolated. So I think you see a lot of the young adult Gen Zers that are coming into the workforce right now have some underdeveloped skill sets, which would be incredibly beneficial. I think in Gen Alpha below that, we're probably seeing technology play an even bigger role. And who knows what the long-term impacts of that are. There's the potential for it to really provide a great educational platform and expose kids to more knowledge and information than they've ever been exposed to before. But there's also the potential for it to melt their minds, like the boomers would say.
Do you think there's, in our men's group, we talk about generational curses or just generational things that have happened and been passed down? Do you see, or do you think that now these kids, us, are breaking that cycle? Or are we adding to it?
Yeah, I think what the term that I would probably use to refer to what you're talking about is generational trauma.
Yeah.
I think what you're referring to, at least in my kind of education experience, is generational trauma. It's very true that each generation carries their traumatic experience and transposes it onto their children. As a Black man, you for sure have generational trauma somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Native populations have tons and tons of generational trauma, whether it was from genocide in the 19th century or from being put into reform schools or whatever it may be. Native Americans are an excellent example of that, including whether it's alcoholism or drug use or whatever it might be. Those things ravage those populations because at some point, people in positions of power ravage those communities. And I think we probably see that as well with the current generations that you're talking about, perhaps to a lesser degree than some of those more significant generational traumas, though.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
That's a wrap.